changing the way we view the First World War in Britain. Now, we're all familiar with the interpretation that in the decades running up to the centenary, we saw a set of relatively consistent narratives about the meaning of the First World War. So Dan Todman's excellent book on myth and memory highlighted public scripts of the last few decades that stressed horror and casualties, leading to an interpretation that both the objectives of the war and the way in which it was fought were futile. And this crowded out other possible interpretations of the war, and it became fairly consistent across lots of different media. A variety of other studies have come to similar conclusions when they were looking at what the public were thinking on the centenary of the outbreak of the war. So we've got the Remember the World as well as the War Report, which was produced by the British Council with Katrina Pinnell's support. And this suggested that people associated the war with trenches, death, loss and futility. And this, along with a survey published by the British Future Commission, July 2013, also suggested the similar things, but actually more importantly that the British public actually didn't know very much about the First World War at all. So if they did know something, it was about futility and loss, but more likely they didn't really know much about the war in the first place. And this is a theme that's been raised by lots of other historians in different ways. It's been suggested that the pattern and content of previous commemorative projects have been narrowly focused, and there's little awareness of global aspects of the war. What I want to look at today, then, is if this futility script is being perpetuated by new commemorative projects, or if we're seeing new departures. And in doing that, I want to look at two projects that I've got up here: the Tower Poppies installation and the Letter to the Unknown Soldier. So first, I want to look at the Poppy installation. Set at the Tower of London, it attracted a staggering 5 million visitors, and I think its popularity alone really means that it's worth studying. Blood-swept land and seas of red was inspired by a line in the will of a Derbyshire soldier who was killed in the war, and the artist Paul Cummins and a set designer Tom Piper created an artwork of 888,246 ceramic poppies in the moat of the Tower of London. Each poppy was supposed to represent the death of a British or Commonwealth soldier, or member of British Imperial Forces if we're talking First World War terms. Funded privately and designed to mark the outbreak of the First World War, the installation grew slowly between July and November 2014 and was conceived as a temporary transitory piece of art, with the poppies then went on to be sold for charity at the end of the period. And what I think what's really important about this type of commemorative project is that it offered a range of opportunities for public interaction. There was the opportunity to be involved in person, so people could apply to be poppy planters and help to create and then dismantle the visual memorial. And this action by itself has been described as a piece of theatre, with over 20,000 people participating. Millions observed. They often queued to go past the poppies and watch them grow, and the spectators also participated in creating artwork by leaving photographs and crosses on the railings around the Tower of London. So people were able to have their own input into the project. The installation was supported by the Historic Royal Palace's learning team, who set out to engage the public by asking 3 key questions. They wanted to know why the public thought we should remember, why 100 years is significant, and how they would like to remember. And volunteers were posted amongst the crowds, collecting responses which were tweeted and posted on blogs. And specific groups of young people were also engaged around those questions to produce film and theatre. So they were the opportunities to engage in person, but there were also opportunities to engage remotely. On the Tower of London's website, dedications to past service personnel could be posted on an electronic version of the poppies in the moat, and a nightly Roll of Honour ceremony in which the names of the First World War fatalities which had been nominated by members of the public were read out. And from mid-August, these ceremonies were filmed at popular request. And I think maybe we can see a clip of those, please. Actually, I need to turn it on, don't I, to get to that. Thank you. kind of gives you, when we eventually see it, a sense of the atmosphere of the poppies and the way in which it was used, in a sense, as a piece of theatre. This is obviously from the 7th of November 2014.
It is working, it's just that I'm afraid it's the buffering from the web that's causing the delay.
That's all right.
We'll try and pause it and restart it, see if it will run again.
Okay, thank you.
Edit this out.
It worked last time I did it. Here we go. They had different people reading out the names. Sometimes comfortable ways, and we'll see how the artist's conception didn't quite match with reality as we go along. For the artists who designed the installation, it had a dual purpose of highlighting the human cost of the war and giving, and I quote, individuals a unique way to tap into their own family history. Their interviews to the press and podcasts on the Tower of London website helped to communicate twin themes of family history and large-scale loss. So that was their conception. It was quite clever in some ways. They were trying to do two different things with it, and they seemed to be fairly successful in the way in which the public engaged with it. The themes clearly resonated with those who volunteered to become poppy planters. One volunteer commented that they were all aware that each poppy represented a life, and as such they were treated with reverence. And I quote, "Each poppy is handmade, unique, and instantly relatable to a fallen ancestor." The installation clearly focuses on death and loss. But how did that affect the way in which people interpreted it, and by extension then the war? Some people wrote of the poppies reinforcing a sense of tragedy. And I quote, "The futility of war is rammed home with every poppy hammered into the ground. What good did their deaths do was asked again and again as we planted. What have we learned from it was another." So that futility script is there very clearly through that kind of response. Others wrote that they planted poppies, quote, to pay their respects to those who died so we can have the life we live today. And this kind of response, I think, is significant. The futility script appears to have been joined by another script that I want to call a sacrificial script. Neither of these narratives deny that the process of fighting the war could be a horrifying experience. Neither of them deny that the scale of loss was significant, but the final interpretation of the war becomes a moral judgment as to whether the scale of death and that individual suffering was deemed worth it. So there are two different takeaways, if you like, from a similar theme. But what about the other millions of visitors who viewed the poppies over the last months? The designer Tom Piper commented that the numbers of people coming to see the poppies were extraordinary, but he also expressed reservations, and I quote, "I would not like to have people come to see it just because it's another thing to do on a day out in town. I hope they're coming to reflect." And it is always a possibility that people were just coming because it was a spectacle, because other people had talked about it, and that's why they're coming to view it. And there's no way of accurately assessing what the motivations of those 5 million people. However, I've had an initial stab at looking at the public scripts that emerged through examining print media, Twitter, and official outputs from the Historic Royal Palace's learning team. In terms of online media, the controversial article in The Guardian, penned by the art critic Jonathan Jones, was extremely useful to me. It helped to gauge public opinion because it elicited over 2,500 responses just to that article alone. And he sparked a debate that prompted many people to write down what the poppies meant to them, and not just on the comments to that article, but all over the web. James suggested that the installation was too dignified to reflect the horror of war and too inward-looking by representing only the British and the Commonwealth's dead. In a sense, he was arguing that the installation enabled public narratives of sacrifice when, in his opinion, the futility script was the only real commentary. His initial article, as I said, attracted 2,500 comments. A minority were supportive of his view, but the majority defended the tower installation, often speaking of its, quote, overwhelming and emotional impact, commenting that just because it was focusing on the dead of National and Commonwealth, it didn't mean that people didn't also think about the millions of dead in other countries. Like the poppy planters, commenters followed similar scripts. The first and most dominant sentiments were that the poppies were a reminder of the tragedy of the First World War, the fact that lessons still needed to be learned as wars still continue. And this is perhaps unsurprising for comments on a Guardian article. But there were also lots of comments about sacrifice for freedom and defence of the British way of life. And again, these comments were sometimes linked to the current work of the contemporary armed forces. So it was seen as having a relevance today and linked to conflicts today in the way in which these poppies were interpreted. And I think the explicit links to more recent conflicts is also interesting. Perhaps the linkage was inevitable. In aiming to raise money for 6 service charities, the installation automatically invites comparison to what's going on today. In a random sample of public dedications on the Tower of London website, it wasn't just the soldiers of the First World War who were being commemorated. It was also those of the Second World War, Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And nor was it just the dead. There were dedications to some people who were still serving. So actually this memorial, in a sense, was not just about the First World War. It was about people who'd fought in other wars too and were continuing to fight. The contemporary link was further reinforced by filming a video of the 2014 British Legion poppy appeal amidst the ceramic poppies. Joss Stone commented that the song chosen, a cover of Eric Bogle's Green Fields of France, stood for, and I quote, peace and the sacrifice made by so many. She overtly linked sacrifice in the First World War to the sacrifice of those serving today, although ironically through the use of an anti-war song where with a conveniently anti-war message, the verses kind of disappeared for that particular rendition. This highlights further that the same concentration on the losses of the First World War can lead to radically different interpretations of its effects. Recognition of the scale of loss can reinforce sacrificial as well as futility scripts. So that's the response in the print media. What about attitudes collected by the Historic Royal Palace's learning team? I'll have to see if we can. Is there a possibility of trying this one too, please? They also sought to capture public attitudes towards the centenary with their questionnaire, challenging individuals to articulate what the centenary means to them. And although they'd received 2,000 responses, they've not yet published their results, so we don't actually know really what comes out of their survey. However, somebody who worked on collecting the responses did write a blog piece in which she also detailed the fact that there were futility and sacrificial scripts there, and she also talked about the fact that people did talk about other deaths around the world and not just Commonwealth and British deaths. What I hope we're going to see here is a video made by some school children, and here it's very clear, you can very clearly see.
I don't think it's going to run, I'm afraid.
You don't? Okay. Never mind. What happened was there were some very clever animated films made by primary school children, and both the films made by primary school children had a very clear sacrificial script to them. Now, there were also plays done by secondary school children, and the futility script was there as well. I'm not saying that the sacrificial script was dominant, but what I think is interesting is it's there, and it hasn't been there in public discussion in the same way in years previously. Of course, their responses are influenced by their educational experience. 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds haven't just made this up themselves. They've been influenced both by their experience of going and looking at the poppies, their experience of their educational experience at the Tower of London. They were given a tour around, they were given mini lectures, and of course their teachers would have had an input. But I still think it's interesting that script is there now, and it wasn't before. Okay. Twitter then, let's have a think about Twitter. A different forum, has a younger age profile than some other media, and we searched under the hashtag @TowerPoppies, which grouped over 100,000 tweets since the beginning of the project. As a snapshot, we analysed a couple of days of tweets in November 2014, March 2015, which was when people were receiving their poppies, so we wanted to see what people were saying about what they thought about them once they got them. And then we looked in August 2015 at the anniversary of when people were remembering essentially what they'd done a year previously. So it was the anniversary of the first planting of the poppies. The view from Twitter was slightly different to the more mediated responses to online articles and museum-prompted questions. Although both sacrificial and futility narratives were discernible, fewer tweets commented on the purpose of the wall. This might be a function of the character limit on a tweet, but the messages tended to be more reflective of the way people felt. So they were talking about how lucky, how humbled, how sad, and how honoured they felt to have participated. They felt that they had taken part in something extraordinary, and so it was all about their emotions really coming out on Twitter. The excitement of receiving the poppy was also well documented, as were the many different ways that people chose to display it. People felt that they'd received something very special, something that was both, quote, a piece of art and a slice of history. And that's a sentiment that's reinforced by the booklet that people received when they got the poppy, entitled Your Piece of History. Unsurprisingly, many were bought in recognition of a family member who had served in the armed forces, mainly in the First World War, but not exclusively. Sometimes it was bought to commemorate people who served in other conflicts. And family connections here, I think, were a very strong theme. Which leads me to two wider points. The Twitter responses highlight the emotional engagement that the poppies elicited. Indeed, the level of engagement far exceeded Tom Piper, the designer's expectations, and he commented, I quote, "When it got to the point it started to become a sort of pilgrimage, it felt familiar in a way I was not comfortable with. I was slightly perturbed by the frenetic, obsessive surge of emotionalism that the installation evoked." And that's a reminder that those who conceive commemoration projects can frame them however they want, but how they're interpreted by the public, they don't necessarily have that control. And it's this emotionalism and the personal identification with the war that I think is also driving this moral interpretation of the conflict. So that's the first point, the emotionalism. But the second point I want to make in relation to the Twitter responses, and maybe to the media more widely, is the importance of the visual in promoting and interpreting the installation. And I've identified two genres of personal photographs that circulated. The first were those beautiful, well-composed shots that were all over the web, as well as the more official media, that sought to capture the beauty in the exhibit, in the ever-changing sea of red. But the second were the photographs that were intended to capture the experience, the selfies being very, very prominent. People wanted to mark the fact that they'd been there and participated. And both type of photographs, I think, helped to generate a popularity for the poppies that may not have been there if that hadn't happened in the first place. So I think the visual part of that memorial is very important. Okay, there are the poppies. I want to have a look at Letter to an Unknown Soldier. I don't know if you're all familiar with this. It was another art project, and this time it was commissioned by 1418 Now, which is a government-funded organisation designed to capture the response of artists to the centenary. So they essentially commission these projects. Unlike the poppies, which was done more independently, this has more government money. Designed by novelists Neil Bartlett and Kate Pullinger, the project was designed to enable the public to rethink what remembrance meant to them. And the vehicle for this was the Paddington Station's Great Western Railway War Memorial, that was a mouthful, on which the soldier stands reading his letter. I'm sure we've all seen it when we go past it in Paddington. They invited the public to write the letter that the soldier's reading and send it on, and then they became published on the website. This new kind of war memorial offers a different opportunity to assess how the public are engaging with the First World War, because the letter format of necessity ensures greater reflection on what people think. So people have to explain a little bit more about what this remembrance means to them. There was an aspiration to be inclusive, and in order to generate a range of responses, they contacted a huge number of groups to seed their project, from creative writing groups to prisoners to school children to serving military, in addition to high-profile writers and personalities, although that is quite dominant. If you look at the website and the way it's presented, the writers and personalities tend to get preferential treatment in a sense. Once up and running, the project received a boost from the participation of David Cameron, and then a flurry of other politicians who didn't want to be left out, and then the contribution of Joanna Lumley and a group of Gurkha recruits, and that became widely publicised by the more traditional media. So with the help of the national press and social media coverage, people did write, and in their thousands. Eventually, the soldier receives over 21,000 letters, which in a space of about 5 or 6 weeks is pretty amazing. They've now been archived on the website, and also a book of a selection of about 150, I think, has been produced. Now, it's very important, I think, to think about how this project is framed. Authors directed the project through who they initially invited to participate, and the ideas they then provided on how to engage. So it wasn't just write a letter to an unknown soldier, it was write a letter to the unknown soldier, and here are some ideas. So people didn't necessarily come up with this independently, if you like. There are two important issues that arise from this. One, encouragement of groups to participate, which meant that writing was often done as a communal activity, and the way in which group leaders introduced ideas might have had a bearing on how the letters ended up. Of course, we don't know how each single group leader framed the question in the first place, but it's important to realise this is a communal activity. It's also important to note that some groups had specific reasons for engaging with the project beyond a personal identification, if you like, with the centenary. Creative writing groups used it as a topic for inspiration, and for many school children it was a compulsory piece of their education. One student stated in his letter he'd written it during detention, which perhaps wasn't in the spirit that the people intended in the first place, but ultimately it did access a range of views that perhaps we wouldn't have had otherwise. The site itself had 6 introductory short films to get people thinking about how they might approach the letter, addressing themes such as who is the unknown soldier, how did the letter get to him, and an encouragement, quote, to voice their own thoughts and feelings on World War I, with perhaps really a greater emphasis on feelings than thoughts. So what did people actually write? Well, the response from the public was eclectic, thoughtful and often deeply felt. There were a number of genres that stood out that I think are worth investigating, and I want to illustrate some of these with some letters. So the first, what the website's authors have termed, in inverted commas, true stories, were prominent, and they were written by those who had known soldiers or by more distant relatives. The 2 writers that I've got up here illustrate the difference. One is a great-great-niece of a soldier whose memory had been kept alive in the family to the extent that she visited his grave as a teenager. Her motivation was to continue the process for future generations, so they would continue to mark his sacrifice, and it was addressed to and dedicated to her uncle. The other writer spoke about her father. It's a much more personal interaction. Her father had suffered what her mother believed to be shell shock. His illness had wreaked havoc on the family, and she'd not truly understood his experience until uncovering his personal records at Kew. She wrote, and I quote, "Through a greater understanding, a gap has been filled, and perhaps a wound somewhat healed." So for this writer, the trauma of the First World War had had an impact on her own life. It was a personal impact. Perhaps for those who were more remote, it's not had the same personal impact. Maybe it had had on previous family. So there's a difference, I think, in the way people write according to what experience they've had. Another type of true story was also present, and I think this is interesting. These were stories that took personal experience of contemporary war and projected those experiences backwards. And again, there were varying motivations for this. The anonymous veteran here dedicated his letter to, quote, the unseen injuries of war, and asked the soldier a series of questions which he then answered himself from his own experience. And I quote, "Do you ever cry when you're alone? I do. Not just for those who've been killed, but for those who suffer every day because of the unseen effects of fighting. Did you ever tell anyone how you felt? I haven't until today. Thanks for listening." It was a raw and powerful letter in which he cast the unknown soldier as a fellow soldier, somebody he could understand. The other writer came from a different perspective. She'd observed friends waiting for the safe return of their children from recent conflicts, and her subject was the mother who waits, suggesting that that was a universal experience that transcends wars. So I think there's a feeling here that there's an experience of war, and because people know war now, can help them understand what happened in the past. Then there are imaginary stories. These formed a really important strand of the Letter to the Unknown Soldier project. They encouraged both the creative orientation of the project and, in some cases, perhaps by an absence of family knowledge. The letter writer often took on the role of a family member. So Dr. Tayal here uses her letter from a Garwal wife to her husband to stretch the definition of unknown soldier to include the whole family, because, she argued, it's everybody who's affected by war. While Ray Morgan, on the other side, wrote a letter as the soldier's lover, describing the war work women were taking on. Morgan's dedication was to the men who fought and died and the women who waited for them, which was actually quite surprising given he'd written about, actually, from a woman's perspective. And finally, there were letters that told the soldier what had happened since he'd been placed on his plinth and assessed how the war had affected those living today. This was a familiar theme for many school children, and you can see a good example of a 5-year-old's interpretation. Heavily directed by her school, she writes, "I am writing this letter to thank you for leaving your family and friends. Now I can go to school and play games with my friends." The other, by Alexander Citron, an editor, explains that debates are still continuing over the war and where the blame lies, and that each subsequent generation tries but fails to prevent conflict. Now, a few obvious observations arise from these letters. The futility and sacrificial scripts are present amongst many if not the majority of the letters, and they're often centred on the fact that people assumed that the soldier had died. And in some cases that was because they'd watched the videos and they'd equated the memorial at Paddington with the tomb of the unknown soldier, and that's where the unknown soldier idea comes from. But many other facets of the war were also explored. Second, many people engaged through a family angle. It was the largest category of letter, with 8,255 people using it. And this is unsurprising, since who's most likely to be writing to the soldier? His family. But I also think it led to a greater acknowledgement that the war affected everybody within the family. It forced people to think about the impact of war on everybody, and women are written back in as key players, both in supporting the soldier, but also experiencing trauma, particularly mothers. And there's also an acknowledgement that the war was a global one, that it affected families around the world, not just those of families of British troops. But I've seen far fewer letters examining the war from the perspective of the opposing side. So there's almost an acknowledgement that yes, it's a global war, yes, it involves imperial troops, but the ability to put yourself in the opposing side's shoes isn't quite there. Not exclusively, but not quite. Finally, there's the question of how these letters are presented as a new kind of war memorial. This you can see a screenshot of what the memorial looks like, or one of the pages of the memorial. Lucy Noakes has suggested that the structure of the BBC Second World War People's History site enabled people to diversify their stories because certain narratives were still privileged. In a similar way, I think we need to think about the way in which different letters appear on this website. The memorial is fully searchable through keywords and has these following themes that you can see up there available to click. But I haven't discovered the criteria that were used to choose them, so I don't quite know what the thinking was behind them. Are the authors of the website shutting down other views of the war by not listing them here? Perhaps. They've made this decision to choose those categories. But actually they're quite eclectic in themselves. They're not just presenting one view of the war. And I guess at some point you've got to make a decision about how you're going to present it and how much. You can't have hundreds of buttons on there. That wouldn't really work. I think the list shows a far greater diversity of views visible about the First World War than we've seen in the recent past. And by way of contrast, the anthology that they produced purposely didn't have themes. They just, obviously it was still selective, but they picked a whole range of different letters. So I suppose their aim in the anthology, although they don't explicitly say it, is to show the diversity of response that they got to their project. So I hope I persuaded you that public scripts about the war are now becoming a little bit more diverse. But the question remains as to why. Why is this happening now? I think there are potentially many different reasons, and we can perhaps do that in questions to explain it, but what I want to do is look at this through the lens of the family. For me, the family has provided inspiration and motivation for the commemorative projects, as well as a lens through which many people have come to view the First World War. They begin with direct family memories. Let me begin with direct family memories of people who knew about those who participated in war. This cohort of people is now obviously pretty small, but those memories were central to some people's involvement in the project. Joe Winter has suggested that telling family stories was a way of converting trauma into something manageable, and perhaps this was what their daughter was doing, who wrote her letter to the unknown soldier about her father. She certainly described it as cathartic. A larger category of people that have no direct memories themselves. There were sometimes family stories passed down, but often the knowledge of many families' involvement had been lost until they're then reclaimed by family historians. And here I think it's important to consider the phenomenon of family history. In her work on genealogy and kinship, the sociologist Anne-Marie Kramer has highlighted two key concepts of identity building and belonging that I think can start to maybe help us think about why people are reacting in the way they are to the First World War. She argues that identity building is a key motivation for genealogists. It's about investigating the self and shaping a family identity. The dead remain social agents, and genealogists seek to appropriate their traits and behaviour and borrow prestige from their ancestors. Therefore, family history isn't really about history at all. It's about the family now. And what's also interesting is that the families tend to pick and choose the ancestors that they feel most fit with how they, and to present to the world with how they feel in the present. This social practice helps to explain the emotional engagement with the projects and the personal identification with the war, and it also potentially explains some of those current public narratives. I've argued in the past that British society in general no longer views victimhood as necessarily negative, so suffering and victimhood can help to provide a point of connection that relatives seek with their ancestors. But I can also see that connecting with a sacrificial narrative could also bolster a family identity, perhaps encouraged by the visibility of alternative narratives encouraged by the projects. In both ways, they could claim that their family, and then by extension themselves, were part of a very significant event in history. Connected with family identity is this concept of belonging. Kramer points out that in an atomized society where family bonds are stretched, people seek rootedness. And the act of seeking rootedness is as important as actually gaining that rootedness. And so the process of family history and the process of doing that research is as important as what they find out in the end. And this, I think, might help to express the mass popularity of the Poppies installation in particular. It provided an opportunity to bring families together, both physically, so often families would participate within the poppy planting or the viewing all together, and there's often interviews of 3 generations of family. But also connecting families across generations through the memorialising process. The participation of families was quite striking. People didn't necessarily, though, have to have relatives to join in. Second, one woman had initially chosen to plant poppies with her brother to mark his birthday and reconnect with him. And she experienced, and I quote, a spirit of togetherness of comradeship and family. That's what I felt when planting the poppies, and that's what people feel when they go and see them. We want a feeling of belonging, of sharing an experience. And that's what I think many of the selfies are about. They're documenting an experience, and many of those 100,000 tweets are doing exactly the same thing. They're capturing a moment of togetherness with other family, but also with a community, if you like. I'm not entirely sure about this point, so I'll throw it out there and see what people think. But I think the projects also illustrate the extent to which the First World War can be conflated with other conflicts, particularly in terms of commemoration. And this association, therefore, has an impact on the way in which the First World War is viewed. So people use the poppies to remember relatives with whom they had a personal relationship, so more recent relatives, as well as relatives who'd fought in the First World War. And while the First World War has been seen as a futile one in the last decades, other wars have not. And I think the conflation of these wars perhaps then complicates the picture of the First World War. And finally, the use of the family as a tool to engage with the projects has prompted an appreciation that the war affected families across the globe, not extended to the opposing side in the same way. And that's not the global aspect isn't a dominant narrative, but I think it's an emerging one that we need to think about. British public narratives about the First World War that have emerged from these projects are definitely more diverse than those we've seen over previous decades, but they're not truly embedded in a more complex understanding of the war. These commemorative projects, through providing some historical context, were more about exploring what commemoration means to people today, and as such, their responses are rooted in contemporary social needs and concerns, and ultimately it's what's happening today that is shaping commemoration, and not necessarily what happened in the past. Thank you. I think we've got 5 minutes for questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have sort of a question. I wonder the extent to which the connectedness in family